Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Tonight, I have for you a collection of 10 ghost stories, each more disturbing and terrifying than the last. Settle into your favorite chair, dim the lights, and let the world fade away. As you listen, remember to keep your mind open and your senses sharp. Sometimes, the things we dismiss as imagination are far closer than we realize. Our first story begins on a quiet, rain-slicked road in rural Vermont. This road, locals whisper, is avoided by anyone who knows the stories. They say the fog that drifts across it at night doesn't behave like ordinary fog. It creeps, curling into shapes that look like faces, arms, even entire figures. It was one such night that a man named Peter found himself driving this road alone, his headlights slicing through the mist. He was returning from a late shift at a nearby diner, exhausted, longing for the warm glow of home. As he rounded a particularly sharp bend, the fog thickened unnaturally, swallowing the edges of the road. That's when he noticed her, a woman standing at the roadside, drenched, her white dress clinging to her body as if she had been in the rain for hours. Her hair was dark, plastered to her face, and her eyes seemed to pierce straight through him. Peter slowed, heart pounding. Normally cautious, he would have stopped to offer help, but something about her was wrong. Something about her was off. He blinked, and suddenly, she was gone. The spot where she had stood was empty, save for the slick, dark asphalt. Peter laughed nervously, blaming exhaustion, imagining a trick of the fog. But when he glanced at the rearview mirror, he saw her again, now sitting in the back seat of his car, hair falling over her face, unmoving, staring at him. The seatbelt indicator lit up. He hadn't buckled her in. He hadn't even picked her up. Panic gripped him. He swerved, his tires squealing against the wet road, and when he dared another glance in the mirror, the seat was empty. No wet footprints, no sign she had ever been there. Peter didn't sleep that night. Even when he returned to that road during the day, the memory of her eyes lingered, and the oppressive feeling of being watched never left. Some say she was the spirit of a woman who had died decades earlier, struck by a car in that very spot. Others say she's something else entirely, a shadow, a memory, a hunger that clings to the living. Whatever she was, Peter never drove that road alone again. Our second story takes us to the outskirts of New Orleans. In a neighborhood where the houses are centuries old and the air carries the weight of untold histories. A young woman named Marissa had moved into one such house, enchanted by its high ceilings and original hardwood floors. She loved the charm of the old home, even if it came with creaking floorboards and drafty windows. But it wasn't the draft that unsettled her. It was the sound of children laughing in the dead of night. Marissa didn't have children, and the nearest neighbors lived blocks away. The laughter would begin softly, almost imperceptibly, but always at the same hour. 2:13 a.m. She tried to ignore it at first, chalking it up to pipes settling, a figment of her imagination. But one night, as the sound grew louder, she decided to investigate. She crept down the narrow hall, each step slow and careful, her breath visible in the cold air. The laughter led her to the parlor, where a small rocking chair swayed back and forth. Empty. She froze, staring, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. The chair stopped, silence falling like a heavy curtain. Then, a whisper, "Play with us." Marissa spun around, but the hallway was empty. She didn't sleep that night, or the nights after. Days later, she discovered an old journal tucked into the walls, left by a child who had lived there nearly a century before. The entries spoke of games played at night, unseen friends, and an unshakable loneliness. Some spirits, it seems, never grow up. Story 3 brings us to the mountains of West Virginia, where fog blankets the valleys and the wind carries secrets through the trees. A group of friends, eager for adventure, decided to camp near an abandoned mining town. The structures were skeletal, the windows gaping like empty eyes, and the rusted equipment groaned as the wind passed through. They arrived at dusk, setting up their tents as the last light faded, unaware of the eyes watching from the shadows. As night fell, they gathered around the fire, telling stories to keep themselves awake. But the firelight danced across the ruins in strange ways, revealing shapes that didn't belong. One friend, Daniel, swore he saw a miner's shadow moving along the roof of a collapsed building. At first, they laughed it off, imagining tricks of the light. But when they shone their flashlights toward the roof, there was nothing. No debris had shifted, no figure remained. Yet the sensation of being watched grew unbearable. Then the sounds began. The clang of metal, the scraping of boots against stone. One by one, the friends saw figures emerging from the fog. Men in soot-streaked overalls, faces obscured by shadow, eyes glowing faintly. They tried to flee, but the terrain seemed to twist, elongating paths and confusing their sense of direction. When they finally reached the edge of the town, gasping and terrified, the fog lifted just enough to reveal the ruins as empty, silent, normal. But the fear lingered. They knew, somehow, that the miners hadn't left. They were still there, waiting, bound to the place by tragedy. Our fourth tale is set in an old farmhouse in rural Maine, where a family had settled for generations. Emma, a teenager, had always been sensitive to the world around her. She could sense presences, hear whispers, and feel touches that no one else did. One winter evening, as a storm raged outside, she sat by the fireplace reading. Suddenly, the fire dimmed, the temperature dropping so quickly she could see her breath. A shadow passed across the room, elongated, human-shaped but grotesquely tall. "Emma," it whispered, low and rasping, her name carrying a weight she couldn't explain. She froze, unable to move, her eyes locked on the figure materializing near the doorway. Her parents, upstairs, heard nothing. Emma, trembling, watched as the shadow approached, stopping just short of the firelight. She could feel its gaze, heavy and oppressive, as if measuring her very soul. Then, without warning, it vanished, leaving only the smell of cold earth and decayed wood behind. Emma would never forget the feeling of being seen by something that was not meant to be seen. The fifth story takes a different turn, to a city apartment in Chicago, where a man named Luis had just moved into a high-rise. The building was modern, clean, and safe, or so it seemed. The first few nights were uneventful, but around midnight, he began hearing whispers from the walls, soft and indistinct. At first, he ignored them, attributing the sounds to the building settling. But the whispers grew louder, forming words he couldn't recognize, but somehow understood. Get out. One night, the lights flickered, and he felt a presence standing behind him. Though no one was there, a cold hand seemed to brush against his shoulder. Panicked, he turned, and the room was empty. The whispers intensified, now forming urgent, threatening sentences. Louis spent that night pacing, unable to sleep, until the sun rose and the presence faded. He tried reasoning with himself. Logical explanations, the stress of moving, anything. But the feeling of being watched persisted. He eventually left the apartment, never returning. But the whispers, he says, sometimes haunt him still. Our sixth story takes us to the outskirts of a sleepy town in Kentucky, where a man named Samuel inherited a small, weathered cabin from his late uncle. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by dense forest, and had long been rumored to be haunted. Locals spoke of strange sounds, doors opening on their own, and glimpses of shadowy figures near the tree line. Samuel, a skeptic by nature, dismissed these tales. He wanted a quiet retreat, a place to escape the bustle of city life. The first night was uneventful, almost too quiet. Samuel sat in the cabin's small living room, a fire crackling, and thought about how peaceful it all seemed. Then, just as he was drifting into sleep, he heard it. A soft rhythmic tapping coming from the ceiling. At first, he assumed it was the roof settling, or perhaps a branch striking the cabin. But the tapping continued, deliberate, almost like someone walking across the ceiling above him. He grabbed a flashlight and investigated, finding nothing. No attic, no crawl space, just the empty ceiling. Over the next few nights, the activity escalated. Footsteps echoed through the cabin. Doors creaked open and slammed shut, and whispers seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Samuel's skepticism began to erode. One evening, as he sat at the small kitchen table, a shadow appeared in the corner of the room. It was humanoid but distorted, taller than any man, with elongated limbs and no discernible features. It simply stood there, watching. Samuel froze, unsure whether to flee or confront it. The shadow dissipated when he blinked, but the lingering feeling of its gaze remained, heavy and suffocating. By the third week, Samuel's sleep was shattered. Each night, the shadows grew bolder. One night, he awoke to a figure kneeling at the foot of his bed. Its presence radiated malevolence, and though he couldn't see its face, he could feel its hatred pressing down on him. Samuel bolted upright, only to find the room empty, the bed unoccupied. When he finally left the cabin, he didn't look back. But friends who visited later reported seeing figures moving behind the windows and hearing the same rhythmic tapping from above, echoing through the forest. Story 7 brings us to a small coastal town in Oregon, where a fisherman named Harold had spent decades at sea. One stormy evening, after returning from a long trip, he found a package waiting on his doorstep. Inside was a small, intricately carved box, unmarked, containing a single, withered photograph of a woman he didn't recognize. That night, as the wind howled and the waves crashed, Harold began to notice shadows moving along the walls of his home. At first, he thought it was the flickering candlelight, but the movements were deliberate, synchronized with his footsteps. Over the following nights, the shadows took form, coalescing into the shape of the woman in the photograph. She would appear at the edge of the room, just outside the reach of the candlelight, silently observing him. Occasionally, she would whisper his name, her voice barely audible above the storm. Terrified, Harold tried to discard the photograph, destroy it, even leave town. But each time he returned, the figure was there, waiting, and the photograph reappeared on his doorstep, unscathed. Friends suggested he seek help, but the woman's presence seemed bound to him, an inescapable force that thrived on fear. Our 8th story is set in an abandoned hospital in upstate New York. For years, the building had been left to decay, its hallways littered with debris and medical equipment. Urban explorers often spoke of strange occurrences, lights flickering without power, doors opening on their own, and the faint sound of wheeled gurneys in empty corridors. A pair of students, eager to document these legends, decided to spend a night inside with their cameras and recording equipment. At first, the exploration was harmless. They wandered through dark hallways, filming graffiti-covered walls and decayed patient rooms. But as midnight approached, the air grew inexplicably cold. The sound of footsteps echoed from the upper floors, though no one else was present. Suddenly, one of the students, Mia, screamed. The other, Mark, turned to see a figure at the end of the hallway. Pale, gaunt, eyes hollow, dressed in a hospital gown that seemed to hang loosely from its bones. It moved unnaturally fast, gliding toward them, and disappeared when they tried to approach. Panicked, the students attempted to leave, but the building seemed to shift around them. Corridors stretched longer than possible. Staircases led to dead ends, and doors that had been open now refused to budge. They felt watched, hunted, as if the hospital itself were alive, intent on trapping them. Hours later, when they finally escaped as dawn broke, they discovered the footage from their cameras had been corrupted, save for brief frames of the gaunt figure staring directly into the lens, its hollow eyes unblinking, haunting them forever. Story 9 takes us to a quiet suburb in Illinois, where a woman named Linda had just moved into her dream home. The house was charming, with a white picket fence and a garden that bloomed beautifully in spring. But soon after moving in, she noticed unusual occurrences. Objects shifted slightly, cold spots lingered in certain rooms, and at night, she could hear the soft sound of someone walking in the hallway outside her bedroom. Linda initially dismissed these events, attributing them to fatigue and the stress of moving. One night, as she was preparing for bed, she saw a figure reflected in her bedroom mirror. It was a man, standing silently behind her, but when she turned, the room was empty. Over the next few weeks, the appearances became more frequent. Sometimes, he would be standing by the window, looking in, or sitting in a chair that had been empty moments before. Linda spoke to neighbors, researching the house's history, and discovered that a man had died there years ago under mysterious circumstances, and locals believed his spirit remained unable to find peace. Linda installed cameras, hoping to capture evidence and perhaps understand what was happening. When she reviewed the footage, she was horrified. The man appeared on camera even when she knew she was alone, moving impossibly fast and sometimes reaching out toward her, only to vanish when she approached. Sleep became impossible, and Linda eventually left, abandoning the house. But the images on the cameras remain, a chilling reminder that some spirits refuse to leave, and some stories do not end peacefully. Our 10th story is set in the deserts of Arizona, where a group of friends decided to explore an abandoned mining town. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sand-swept buildings. Among them was a man named Eric, fascinated by the idea of ghosts and legends. As night fell, they set up camp in the center of the town, unaware that they were not alone. The wind carried voices, faint but distinct, as if whispering secrets from decades past. That night, Eric awoke to the sensation of being touched. Cold fingers brushed against his arm, leaving a chill that seeped into his bones. When he opened his eyes, he saw a figure standing over the firelight, translucent but unmistakably human, its face twisted in anguish. The friends gathered, but each of them reported seeing the figure in different places at once, moving impossibly fast, circling the camp. The night stretched endlessly, each hour heavier than the last, until the first light of dawn finally broke, revealing the town empty and silent. As if nothing had occurred, the stories of these spirits, these restless entities, linger with those who encounter them, some vanish into the night, leaving behind only a memory or a chill. Others persist, haunting the living, their presence a reminder that death is not always an end, and some souls cannot rest. The first story of this section takes us deep into the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, where a family had purchased an old farmhouse tucked away in the forest. The house had stood vacant for decades, its walls weathered, the paint peeling, and windows staring blankly into the wilderness. The family, eager to start a new life, ignored the warnings of locals who whispered about the farmhouse's dark past, stories of disappearances, of strange figures seen in the fields, and of a presence that never left. At first, life seemed normal. The family settled in, tending the fields and caring for the small barn animals. But soon, subtle things began to occur. Doors that had been locked would be open in the morning. Footsteps echoed in hallways where no one had walked. The children claimed to see a man in the shadows watching them from the corner of their rooms, his form blurry and shifting. At night, the mother would awaken to the sound of whispers, low and insistent, almost beckoning her into the darkened corners of the house. One evening, the father stayed late working in the barn. As he returned, he noticed footprints leading from the barn door directly to the house. But these were not his own, nor those of his children or wife. They were oddly elongated, unnaturally wide, and the prints appeared to shimmer, as if they weren't fully part of this world. When he followed them, they led to the old root cellar, a space long sealed and used only for storage. Inside, he found nothing, but the temperature dropped sharply, and a presence filled the room, heavy and oppressive. He fled, locking the cellar door, but the feeling of being watched persisted for weeks. And eventually, the family left, unable to live under the weight of unseen eyes. Our next tale moves to a quiet, fog-shrouded village in Maine. A woman named Grace had inherited her grandmother's Victorian-era home, a sprawling structure with narrow hallways and towering ceilings. The locals spoke of the house in hushed tones, warning her of the lady in white who roamed its halls. Grace, a rational woman with a scientific mind, dismissed the stories. But the moment she stepped inside, she felt an unsettling chill, as though the air itself resented her presence. The first night, she awoke to the sound of piano keys playing softly, though no instrument existed in the house. At first, she assumed it was her imagination, but the music became more deliberate, forming strange, discordant melodies. As days passed, Grace began to notice the lady in white, not as a shadow or a trick of the light, but fully formed, drifting silently from room to room. Her eyes were hollow, her movements slow and deliberate. Grace attempted to communicate, asking who she was and why she lingered. The figure never spoke, only glided past, leaving a trail of cold, that lingered long after she disappeared. The haunting intensified. Objects would shift, mirrors reflected images that weren't there, and Grace often woke to the sensation of someone standing over her, watching. She reached out to local historians, hoping to uncover the figure's story. They revealed that a young woman, wronged by her family decades ago, had died in the house under mysterious circumstances. Grace realized the spirit was bound to the home, and her presence had awakened something long dormant. Despite trying to leave, the lady in white's shadow followed her, haunting her dreams, a constant reminder that some injustices can echo through time, refusing to be silenced. Our third story takes us to a university campus in Pennsylvania. Late at night, a janitor named Thomas was cleaning one of the oldest buildings on campus, a lecture hall abandoned after decades of neglect. The building had always been rumored to be haunted, students joking about seeing ghosts of past professors. Thomas didn't believe in such tales until he began his nightly rounds. Doors that were locked would creak open. Chalkboards would scribble themselves with formulas and diagrams, as if some unseen hand was still teaching lessons. One night, as he polished the floors, he noticed a figure sitting in one of the desks. An elderly man with piercing eyes, hunched over a book. Thomas called out, but the figure didn't respond. Suddenly, the air turned icy, and the figure vanished, leaving behind a faint smell of old books and dust. Over the following weeks, Thomas experienced repeated encounters. The faint echo of lectures in empty halls. Footsteps pacing above him when no one else was present, and the unmistakable feeling of being observed. By the end of the semester, Thomas had become a believer. Students claimed the building felt wrong at night, and some even reported seeing the old professor teaching in empty classrooms, as if time itself had trapped him in an eternal lesson. The fourth story brings us to a remote lake cabin in Minnesota, where a man named Derek had rented a place for a weekend getaway with friends. The cabin was rustic, the only sounds being the gentle lapping of the water and the wind through the pine trees. On the first night, Derek noticed a figure standing at the edge of the dock. A man, motionless, staring at the water. When Derek called out, the figure didn't respond. Moments later, it vanished. The following day, Derek and his friends explored the surrounding woods, discovering remnants of old cabins and a small cemetery long forgotten. One gravestone bore a name eerily familiar. It matched the last name of the figure Derek had seen. That night, the apparitions became more active. Footsteps circling the cabin, whispers carried on the wind, objects moving without explanation. The friends attempted to rationalize it, blaming shadows and imagination. But when Derek awoke at 3:17 a.m., he saw the figure again, now inside the cabin, standing at the foot of his bed, eyes black, expressionless. Panic gripped him, and the group left at first light, abandoning the cabin to whatever force haunted the lake. Our fifth story takes us to a small town in Louisiana, known for its historic plantations and legends of voodoo. A man named Antoine was visiting family when he stayed at a plantation home converted into a guest house. The first night, he was woken by the faint sound of drums, rhythmic and low, echoing through the halls. Curious, he followed the sound, discovering nothing. But the air grew thick, heavy with the scent of incense, and shadows moved unnaturally along the walls. Each night, the occurrences intensified. Antoine began to see figures in traditional attire, performing rituals in empty rooms. They seemed oblivious to his presence. Yet he could feel their eyes on him, judging, waiting. One night, a figure approached him directly, its hand cold as ice when it brushed against his arm. Terrified, Antoine fled. But the experiences followed him, lingering in his dreams. A haunting imprint of the supernatural that refused to be ignored. These stories, drawn from forests, lakes, abandoned buildings, and historic homes, illustrate a chilling reality. The supernatural exists in many forms. Shadows, whispers, apparitions, and inexplicable occurrences challenge our understanding of the world. For those brave or unlucky enough to encounter them, life is forever altered. A constant reminder that some entities do not belong to the living world, and some tales are not mere stories, but warnings. The first story in this section brings us to an abandoned hospital in Ohio, a building left to decay after a fire many years ago. Urban explorers had long sought it out, lured by rumors of ghostly patients and nurses still wandering the halls. Among them was a young man named Eric, who decided to film the building for his paranormal YouTube channel. From the moment he stepped inside, he felt a suffocating heaviness, as though the air itself resisted him. The first floor was filled with debris, shattered glass, and rusting hospital beds. But as he moved deeper into the building, Eric noticed a faint humming sound, rhythmic and continuous, emanating from the old surgery wing. At first, he assumed it was the wind or old machinery still active. But the sound grew more defined, almost like a chant. He followed it to a stairwell leading to the basement, the steps slick with years of neglect. As he descended, the chanting became clearer, a low, mournful melody echoing off the walls. In the basement, he found old patient files scattered across the floor. Names, dates, diagnoses. Many patients had died under mysterious circumstances. The humming stopped abruptly, replaced by a chilling silence. Then he saw her, a nurse, translucent but detailed, moving methodically as if tending to the sick. Her eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to pierce his very soul. Eric froze, unable to move, unable to look away. The figure raised her hand, beckoning him closer, and a coldness unlike anything he had felt before enveloped him. He fled, leaving behind his equipment, the memory of her hollow gaze haunting him long after he escaped. Next, we move to a story set in a centuries-old church in Scotland. A historian named Fiona was documenting the building's architecture when she encountered strange occurrences. The church was largely empty, save for the occasional visitor. But Fiona felt watched from the moment she entered. As she explored, she noticed shadows moving against the stone walls, shapes that didn't correspond to anything in the room. In one corner, she discovered a series of old paintings depicting saints and local figures. The eyes of the figures seemed to follow her, unsettling in their realism. One painting in particular stood out. A young boy, kneeling, with a terrified expression. Fiona felt compelled to investigate the boy's history and discovered that he had disappeared in the church hundreds of years ago, never to be found. Since then, visitors had reported feeling an unseen presence, especially near the painting. That night, Fiona returned to her lodging and experienced a vivid nightmare. The boy appearing at the foot of her bed, pleading silently, begging her to remember him. She awoke in a cold sweat, the sensation of being watched lingering, proving that some spirits remain tethered to places of injustice, unable to find peace. Our third story takes place in an old railroad tunnel in Nevada. A man named Carlos, fascinated by abandoned infrastructure, explored the tunnel with a flashlight and a friend. The tunnel was notorious locally for strange disappearances and ghost sightings. But Carlos was skeptical. As they ventured deeper, the temperature dropped sharply, their breath visible in the beam of their flashlights. Suddenly, they heard the distant rumble of a train. Though the tracks had been unused for decades, the sound grew louder, deafening, and the walls vibrated as if a phantom engine raced past them. Shadows flickered along the tunnel, forming shapes that resembled passengers, pressed against the walls, staring with hollow eyes. Panic overtook Carlos and his friend, and they sprinted back toward the entrance. Behind them, they heard a chorus of whispers, urging them to return, to join the others who had vanished. The tunnel's legend was true. It had become a liminal space, a place where the living and dead could intersect, but only at great risk. Next is the story of a hotel in New Orleans, infamous for its haunting. Guests reported sudden chills, unseen hands tugging at blankets, and the sound of footsteps in empty hallways. A woman named Marissa, visiting the city for a festival, stayed in room 217, the room most associated with ghostly activity. That night, she awoke to the sound of a man softly sobbing. The noise grew louder, moving around the room. Yet, when she turned on the light, no one was there. The experience escalated. Mirrors reflected figures that vanished when observed directly. A cold hand pressed against her shoulder, and she felt the bed dip as if someone had lain beside her. Terrified, Marissa fled to the lobby, where the receptionist confirmed the room's reputation. Decades ago, a man had died there under suspicious circumstances, and guests since claimed to feel his presence. Marissa never returned to that room, but the memory of the invisible occupant stayed with her, a chilling reminder that some deaths leave a permanent mark on the living world. The fifth story takes place in a rural farmhouse in Tennessee. A couple, recently married, moved into the home, unaware of its violent history. The previous owner had been murdered, and the killer's spirit was said to linger, bound to the place by rage. Initially, the couple experienced minor disturbances, creaking floors, misplaced objects, fleeting shadows. But one night, the activity intensified. The husband awoke to see a figure standing at the foot of the bed, its face twisted in anger. The room's temperature dropped sharply, and he felt an invisible force pressing him into the mattress. The wife awoke screaming, reporting that the same entity had whispered threats in her ear. Over the following weeks, the couple attempted various methods to cleanse the house. Holy water, smudging, and even a local medium. None worked. Eventually, they abandoned the house, leaving behind belongings and memories, unable to withstand the relentless presence. Our final story in this section is set in a remote desert in Arizona, where a group of hikers encountered a ghostly phenomenon. As night fell, they set up camp near an abandoned mining town. Strange lights flickered in the distance, and shadows moved unnaturally among the ruins. At first, the hikers assumed it was their imagination or trickery of the moonlight. But soon, voices emerged, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the very ground beneath them. Figures appeared, translucent miners, wielding tools, moving as if still working despite the town's abandonment. The hikers attempted to flee, but found themselves disoriented, the landscape shifting in impossible ways. When morning arrived, they were found miles from their campsite, unable to recall the path they had taken, haunted by visions that defied explanation. These stories from hospitals, churches, tunnels, hotels, farmhouses, and deserts demonstrate a recurring truth. The supernatural is persistent, varied, and often drawn to locations marked by tragedy. Those who encounter these forces experience events that defy rational explanation, leaving lasting impressions that cannot be dismissed as coincidence or imagination. In our final tale, we return to the idea that some spirits follow not just places, but people. A man named Julian moved into a small apartment in Boston, seeking a fresh start after a difficult year. Within days, he noticed objects shifting on their own and faint whispers echoing through empty rooms. One night, he awoke to the sensation of a presence sitting on his chest, the pressure nearly suffocating him. Shadows danced across the walls, forming shapes that resembled faces in anguish. Julian attempted to ignore the activity, convincing himself it was stress or lack of sleep. But the incidents escalated. Eventually, he captured audio of disembodied voices pleading for recognition, for release. The recordings revealed desperate tones, a mixture of fear, sorrow, and anger, as if the apartment itself held the memories of those long gone. Julian moved out, but the memory of those voices lingered, a chilling reminder that the past never truly leaves and the living often carry the echoes of the dead.